Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm so happy that you've decided to join us for this breakout session today about Slack analytics. I know that many of you may be early adopters of Slack in your organizations, or you might already consider yourselves to be Slack champions. In either case, I know that you've dedicated time, energy, and even money into Slack. And hopefully you've intrinsically seen the value that Slack has brought to your team. Now you may be trying to figure out, how do I measure that value more concretely? Or how do I get my other teams, partner teams, the rest of my organization to adopt Slack and get the same value that my team is getting? You may have set some engagement goals for yourself and your team, but without continued adoption across the organization, those goals are only going to improve your team's outcomes. They're not going to necessarily impact the organization's outcomes overall. So what can you do as a Slack champion or early adopter to help expand the use of Slack and better benefit your entire organization? My name is Lindsay Lamont, and I'm a product manager here at Slack for Insights. I'm joined today by Nick Jested from Tibco, a Slack analytics wizard who you'll be hearing from later. Now, before fully diving into today's session, we wanted to note that we will be having a live Q&A at the end. So please feel free to submit any questions along the way, and know that we'll be keeping an eye on things in the feed and following up in a bit. We have 3 key objectives for today's breakout. First, we want to enable you, our Slack champions, with the skills and context needed to use analytics at your own companies to help drive adoption and ensure that you're getting the most value out of Slack. You should walk away from today with a framework for measuring Slack adoption and engagement that you can use as a starting point for defining how you want to use analytics at your own companies today. Second, we really want to show you this work in practice and highlight the impact that it can have on the value that you're able to leverage out of Slack, again, across your whole organization and not just your team. And lastly, we want to update you on some recent releases and what's coming from Slack Insights later this year and next. But before doing that, let's talk about why any of this engagement and adoption really matters. You may be amazed to know that on average, our users are connected to Slack for about 10 hours a day. And of those 10 hours, users spend roughly 120 minutes actively using Slack. All of that time spent results in more than 5 billion actions across the Slack platform weekly. Do you know how many actions your organization is taking on Slack? How much time people in your org are spending on Slack? For those who are not using Slack, they're not spending any time on Slack. The question is, how do we change that? Because when you have more users engaged, the value of Slack goes up. And while that may be obvious to us, we actually have some stats to show you just that. Recently, Slack partnered with IDC to assess the business impact of our channel-based messaging platform. So, for instance, did you know that your sales team has the potential for 13% shorter sales cycle when using Slack? They're able to spend less time digging through account details and more time addressing the needs of the customer, and ultimately moving deals forward faster. Your engineering teams have the potential to deliver 5% more output and be 23 times faster to market. As a product manager, that is very exciting to me. The centralized tools, automated workflows, and reduced context switching between applications results in more products and services being delivered on time. Similarly, your marketing teams could be executing 16% faster, and your HR teams have the potential to onboard new employees for your teams faster with Slack. And faster onboarding means that new employees can more quickly do the jobs that they were brought on board to do. But all of this potential value from Slack is undiscovered territory from other teams at your organization that are not yet engaged on Slack. That's where you, as an early adopter of Slack at your organization, or as a self-described Slack champion, come into play. Analytics can be a tool to help you drive real adoption and engagement, and therefore more value across your organization. So for those of you who have never accessed Slack Analytics before, you can navigate to analytics in a couple of different ways. If you're on a free, standard, or plus plan, you can access workspace analytics by going to tools and then analytics, as in this image. And then if you're a grid customer, org analytics can be found on the org settings page. Now, all of you on this call, let's do a quick exercise. Try and find your own analytics pages. And once you have them open, leave them up, and I challenge you to follow along for the rest of the presentation in your own analytics and see what you can discover there. All users, just so you know, by default have access to workspace analytics. However, owners and admins can limit that access. So if you happen to not see analytics, that's probably the reason why. Once you open your workspace analytics, you're going to see three different sections: overview, channels, and members. The overview page provides daily insights on things like active members, total messages, and where your messages are being read or sent. Channel analytics will provide recent and all-time activity for each of your channels. So this includes things like active members, total messages, and reactions sent, as well as the total number of members who are reading or writing in that channel as well. And lastly, member analytics provides insights on the member or the user level. For example, when a specific user was created, or the total number of messages that they've sent in the last 30 days. Now, if you're an enterprise grid customer and looking at org analytics, you have similar information, but you're able to see this for the organization as a whole, for each of the workspaces, and for org-wide channels, in addition to the standard set of workspace analytics. And lastly, as an analyst at heart, what's great about this data is that it can all be exported into a CSV using the export button. With exports, you can join this data with other internal reports and get a little bit more creative about how you may want to use it. So now that you all have access to analytics and hopefully have your dashboards up and running, let's walk through how we at Slack like to think about measuring the value of Slack overall. On a macro level, you need to know to what degree is Slack supporting your productivity and your business goals. Is your organization more productive, agile, or aligned on Slack? And you can go a step further even to start to identify user behaviors that actually drive these values. On a more micro level, we can start to answer these questions by digging into engagement analytics and looking specifically at adoption. What is the breadth of your Slack usage? For example, are my employees actively using Slack? Are they actively logging in and accessing messages? Maturity, what is the depth of Slack usage? For example, are users sharing information in public channels, making information more accessible? Are they taking advantage of all of the other features? And sentiment, are my users happy with their Slack experience? Does it make their lives easier? Let's dive into adoption. If you're following along in your workspace analytics, make sure to navigate now to the overview page. Here you're going to find active daily members. And again, adoption measures the breadth of usage. Are my employees actively using Slack? For most applications, we see that weekly usage best captures work. In this chart, for a sample workspace that we've pulled up, you're going to see fairly standard engagement patterns. Users tend to drop off on the weekends, although not entirely. And in this specific example, I've highlighted in pink a Friday that this company happened to have off. You'll see usage dropped off fairly significantly, but not quite as much as on the weekends. Now, looking at your dashboards, can you compare how active users, maybe total messages sent, have changed between this summer and last? Has your Slack activity increased since shifts to working from home? How has your organization's adoption changed overall? Maturity, the second component we wanted to look at, offers a different dimension than adoption. It really measures the depth of Slack usage. Are your users taking advantage of all that Slack has to offer? And can we discover and measure the behaviors that are helping to make your company more productive? So for example, in this particular workspace, you can see that roughly 70% of messages are sent as direct messages. There are super valid reasons for using all three message types: public channels, private channels, and DMs. At Slack, we recommend using public channels as much as you can so that others within the company can benefit from that knowledge sharing. So for those of you with your dashboards open, try clicking into where people are reading next to where messages are sent. It should be at the bottom of your overview page. You might see that this ratio shifts a little bit towards public channels from DMs. Typically, when I see this, that shift really again highlights to me the power of channels as knowledge centers. Users may not be posting messages in every channel, but they are visiting channels and reading channels to find information. Now, we know that data doesn't tell the whole story. It's also important to hear from your employees about what's important to them and how they feel about their productivity tools. Data can help you to identify problem areas and success areas, but pairing that information with live quotes from users is super important in driving real behavioral change for your organization. A number of Slack champions we've spoken to find power in features like Polly, which is a lightweight surveying tool, to gauge how users feel about Slack and to provide feedback. While tools like Polly do have an added cost, we have seen them be quite successful due to their ease of use in the Slack client itself. I know that Nick, who you guys are going to be hearing from in just a bit, will touch upon this as well when he discusses adoption at TIBCO. But before passing it off to Nick, let's talk a little bit about what's coming next. These out-of-the-box dashboards are powerful, but we've heard from all of you that you need more flexibility and granularity around analytics data. In the coming months, we'll be releasing Slack's first set of APIs dedicated to programmatically serving analytics data. For customers looking to gain a deeper understanding of Slack engagement at scale, the new APIs will allow you to analyze Slack engagement based on KPIs that your organization cares about, automate routine reporting tasks, saving you time, and compare Slack engagement with other tools. APIs in general can power more advanced and custom analytics, exactly the type of insights that Nick at TIBCO has discovered. On that, I want to pass it off to Nick now, who can show you that the sky's the limit when it comes to the power of analytical data. Take it away, Nick.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm very excited to be here, and thank you so much for having me join you to talk about kind of what TIBCO's done and our incredible partnership with Slack. So as Lindsay mentioned, I'm the Director of Talent Analytics at TIBCO Software. I'll give you a little bit of background about me, and then I'll tell you a little bit about TIBCO. I kind of started in this whole journey with a passion for computer science and data science. And that led me to, this field where you're trying to uncover what's hidden and what's maybe a little bit below the surface. TIBCO obviously let me do that and join my passion for computer science and data with my passion for people. And, our HR department here is really focused on that holistic journey of when somebody joins the organization, making sure that they kind of get to experience the organization, that they're engaged, that they get to bring their whole self to work, and that we really get to uncover how to make TIBCO a great place to work for them. So that partnership with Slack was kind of born out of that very same thing. I had a passion for people. We had a passion at TIBCO for uncovering, what was engaging for folks and how to let them collaborate, interact, and engage with one another. Collaboration was a big focus for us and our leadership team, and it was something we weren't sure how to do and how to accomplish. And that's what led to our partnership really with Slack, making sure that we could join our data with Slack's data and understand how our employees can cross boundaries and eliminate silos. So a little bit about TIBCO. I work for a company that has that data connectivity and analytics in their DNA. In this space, it was about how do we find what we have to offer and what Slack has to offer to tell this story and make sure that something could be integrated in our workforce's day-to-day operations that allows them to collaborate and interact with their peers and lead to increased productivity at work. So, as Lindsay mentioned, Slack has native tools for adoption, and that's kind of where our journey started as well. We wanted to better understand Slack adoption at TIBCO, who was using it, who was not using it, and what that meant as far as collaboration would go. Now, adoption was our first stop. We had to understand who was using it and why they were using it in order for us to maximize its potential. So we started a lot how Lindsay just demonstrated. We started with those native Slack adoption metrics, and we got in there and saw the population that was provisioned for Slack, and that was provided by our CSM, to look at what users were in the platform, who should be in the platform, and then set our own targets. So a little bit more background. We launched Slack across our entire company in July of 2019. Prior to that point in time, we did have it used in pockets among our engineers, our IT team, our marketing team, but we wanted to fully roll that out. And so in July of 2019, you'll see this pretty big jump in our provisioned users and in those that are using the platform. So we can start to look at both our active users and our active messengers, the people that are actually using the platform to connect with others and send content. And what we noticed initially was that our goal of 90% of adoption was not being met. We had a gap there, and we weren't sure why. And that's where we needed to really understand what was working and what was not working at TIBCO and what was making this platform, in our engagement with Slack, useful. So we had to uncover this delta. As I mentioned, there wasn't a lot of understanding as to what was causing that delta or even where it was. As you get into the Slack analytics, it will show you, and you can look now and see are you meeting your goals? Are people active? Are they engaged with the platform? But we couldn't understand who was, who wasn't, and why. And so our initial goal was pretty standard, just 90% target. But now we wanted to take that to the next level. Where was that 90% being met? If it was, who was not using it, and why weren't they using it? And we needed to understand that so we can make Slack a better tool at TIBCO for its adoption and use. So what we did is we ended up pulling our Slack data, as Lindsay mentioned, you can export it, and we began to integrate that with our human capital data. So at your company, you may have a human capital system. There's a few like SuccessFactors, Oracle. At TIBCO, we use Workday, and we decided to merge our data with the data out of Workday so we can start to tell the story of who was using it and where. And that led us to our first breakthrough. And it's a pretty simple one. We merged our activity levels in Slack with our workforce data in Workday to start to say what functions, what regions, what areas of our company were using Slack, to view the platform, to see messages, and who was actively sending messages. And this is where we got a few simple but critical insights. For starters, we could see that our marketing team, our IT team, and our engineering team were consistently using Slack. Not a surprise. They were using it prior to the global launch. We could see new groups like us in HR had taken to Slack pretty early on. It was something that fit a lot of our use cases. It was a good way, as Lindsay mentioned, for us to onboard new people and bring them up to speed and to share resources with the workforce. But we did see that there was an attrition of groups that didn't find the use for Slack initially, and we certainly weren't hitting that early 90% target. And I'm going to focus specifically on our go-to-market group. So that customer excellence group, which has our sales teams and a lot of our customer-facing folks, were not as engaged on the platform, certainly not meeting that 90% target, and we didn't understand why. This really helped us isolate and identify that group needed some attention. As Lindsay mentioned, data is not everything. It kind of gives you the coordinates. And so what we had here was a specific area of focus. So we engaged our Slack champions. We engaged our leadership. We engaged people that were in the go-to-market group that were using Slack to say, what's working, what's not working, and how can this be better? As Lindsay mentioned, we leveraged Poly. Poly was a tool that we could start to understand and pull the workers in this group and say, what would you like to see out of Slack to make it work better for you on the day-to-day? What's keeping you from it? And as they started to share resources and information with us, we found some critical insights. They wanted to be able to have conversations with customers, and they couldn't. We didn't have guests in our environment yet, and that was something we needed to uncover. We didn't have critical integrations that would make their day-to-day work seamless, like Salesforce. So we started to make it more applicable for them and really engage with them so that they could find the use out of Slack that the rest of the departments had, and so that we could increase their adoption. As I mentioned, adoption was our baseline, and we had to get that there for us to do any of the fun stuff that we'll talk about here in a moment. But we didn't stop there. One of the things we found, and this is one of my most favorite early analyses we did, but one of the things that we found was there were pockets, no matter the region, no matter our business unit or functional area, where people were active and engaged on Slack and where other individuals were not. So beyond this baseline, by work assignment details that we could bring in, we wanted to leverage our leadership. And so we did a quick analysis that looked at leader activity, some of our directors, our VPs, versus their team's activity on Slack. And we found a pretty significant positive correlation. As leaders were more engaged, thereby their teams were more engaged. And this is specifically true when we saw leaders engaged in public and private channels versus DMs. And that makes intuitive sense. And that's sort of the story we started to put together with our leadership team. DMs may not be visible to the whole workforce. Channels are. And so as leaders began to set the tone and model the behavior that was expected of us here at TIPCO, they can sort of say, hey, this is our new normal. We're open to collaboration. We're open to transparency. We want to show you what we're thinking, what's going on, and we want you to participate in that conversation with us. It was very conversational. And so we opened the doors to this insight, again, a pretty simple one, but turned it to our leadership team and said, hey, if we want this to be an investment for us that pans out in the long run and is sustainable, then we need to get our workforce seeing that their leaders care and that they want to engage and interact with them on this platform as well. As we turned this analysis inward, it was a real eye-opener for a lot of our leadership to say, oh, I have to use channels. I need to engage. I need to invite conversation. As we did this, we saw adoption increase everywhere. And this was a significant finding for us at TIPCO that we wanted to leverage because it, again, is sustainable. It also helped us with outliers. So there's in a group, you can see it. It's our most engaged team at Slack up here, pretty high on the vertical axis, versus a leader that was not that engaged. That was our new head of marketing. Had come in, his team loved using Slack, had consistently used Slack. That's kind of how they engaged and collaborated at work. And he was new to the company. He didn't understand that yet. And in a quick demonstration of this graph, he got it. And we said, hey, you've got to use it. And he quickly started leveraging all the channels and kind of, even the fun emojis and everything you can do with Slack to let his team know he was there. This is the behavior he was going to adopt as well. And as he got in there, his team was reinforced. So where did this leave us? Well, after having conversations with the go-to-marketing team and saying, how can we make this better for you? After meeting with our Slack champions and saying, what does it need to do? What integrations do we need? What guests do we need? What channels do we need to allow the conversation to happen where you want it and to be part of your day-to-day job? We could also, talk with our leaders and say, hey, you've got to be present. You've got to be present, transparent, and open. And if you are, that's also going to lead to increased behavior. And when we started to see that adoption happen across our leadership and across, just a dedicated focus to us making improvements where folks wanted it, we saw a marked improvement in our engagement on the platform. So from January of 2020 to June of 2020, we saw a huge jump in adoption. And if we revisit that simple 90% goal that we had set when we launched Slack, we had now met it. And not just overall, but within every single functional area. This was critical for us. Again, adoption is kind of the table stakes. You need to have it to allow us to focus on, are we breaking down silos? Are we open and transparent? Are we allowing our employees to communicate with their leadership and interact in a meaningful way? And now we had a dedicated strategy for how to look at adoption more holistically and make sure that we were asking the right questions to the right people. We also know that adoption isn't a one-time measurement that you kind of check off. It's a sustained thing. If adoption ever drops, then you can't do the fun analyses and it doesn't become a longitudinal investment. We wanted to make sure that adoption was sustained over time and that our employees were constantly finding use in Slack, especially through things like a global pandemic. So we ended up building a dashboard in a tool that we're pretty proud of here at TIPCO called TIPCO Spotfire. This allows us to dynamically look at our data and pull data from various resources and connect it together. This allows us to say, what is our average message rate on the platform by group? What is it as you isolate by channel or by direct message? Can you see how it's peaked and changed over time? And this has allowed us to really triangulate and continue to ask those questions, not once, but on an ongoing basis with our Slack champions and with our leadership team. So what are the takeaways for adoption? As I mentioned, leaders are absolutely essential to downstream adoption. You need to have them involved and engaged, and in doing so, you can really change the behavior. It makes it more conversational, it makes it more transparent, and it sets the tone. The next thing is kind of what Lindsay alluded to. Data doesn't say everything. It gives you the coordinates to have the right conversations with the right people. And as I mentioned, and I'll continue to mention, adoption's not a one-time thing. You got to monitor it often so you can keep it sustainable. And that leads to my most exciting area of analysis that we've done at TIBCO, especially in our partnership with Slack. So our CSM, Willis Stebbins at Slack, and in partnership with the analytics team there, led by DJ Thompson, who's really been partnering with us, we've done some really incredible work in the field of collaboration. Now, remember, that was kind of where TIBCO set off to begin with. What's working? Where do silos exist? And can we start to break those down so that people can have more meaningful peer relationships across our company? We started with something called network analysis. Now, here's the technical side, then we'll get into the fun stuff. The technical side looks at how close the relationships are between individual users of Slack. Who's connected is represented by a line, or in this case called an edge. As it's closer together, it means that relationship's more stable, it's more secure, it's more prolific. They might be conversing more often. They might be having more meaningful conversations, and it's reciprocated. Each individual user in our environment is one of these dots on the next graph. So what does it look like for TIBCO? Well, it looks like this spider web. Now, you might not see a ton of information in this data, and until we orient you, it can be a little difficult. At least that's what our leaders say. So let me walk you through some of the cool areas here that we've really unpacked, and one of the reasons I love these graphs so much. Between January and June, we saw a clustering. The relationships that had existed became more meaningful, much more tightly packed, and our densification happened overnight. You can see that the density increased by 233% in those 6 months, and a lot of that led by the pandemic, the necessity to do so. We also saw more users connected, less silos. Now, this spiderweb graph, as I like to call it, doesn't show a lot of information, so you can start to overlay some really critical areas, and this comes back to our workforce data. We brought in data like region to see our 4 primary regions at TIBCO and how they interact in this area. We can see in the cluster in the center that it's pretty collaborative across regions. There's representation across the globe in that dense center. But we can also see areas, on the outsides, on the outskirts, and where there might be silos and what this represents. Now, overall, you can see a time zone pattern here. Of course, that's pretty standard. But you can also see specific groups. Even in Europe, in EMEA, for example, you can see this area out to the left where it's, a little siloed. Now, we can get even more nuanced if we bring in our department level data, our functional areas. We can see our engineers. We can see our customer excellence go-to-market group again. We can even see our areas like marketing, HR, et cetera. We can see how tightly packed and dense that group is and where they're connected. But we can, again, layer in and see that silo. So we have that silo in Europe, but it also tends to overlaps with that go-to-market group. And we start to say, okay, what's going on here? And can we have a conversation with them so that they can feel connected? So they're making the right peer connections. So they're kind of getting the network that's critical for them to succeed and for them to collaborate. Why is this so important? Well, I'll tell you. The go-to-market groups that's the most connected are the ones that have the most success with customers. They can leverage their network to ask questions. They can move more agilely. They can get their questions answered and reduce the time it takes to respond to a customer inquiry and to really close a deal. That's something we found at TIBCO by leveraging this network analysis, and it was so cool. Now, not everybody loves this spider chart quite like I do, this web chart. So we also are able to bring this out into a table and kind of look at this. And so one of the really cool insights that we found was 50% of the connections that are happening at TIBCO right now are with groups in other departments. They're outside of your home base. They're outside of your functional area. And when we set off to, bring Slack into TIBCO to start with, it was because we said, hey, I don't think that our workforce is conversing with folks outside of their home base, outside of their region, outside of their business unit. Can we drive that behavior upwards? Well, I can say definitively over the last year with Slack and analyzing this data, absolutely. Even in key groups like marketing, you can see 60% of their connections happen outside of marketing. These conversations are happening and we're eradicating silos, and that's super meaningful work. It's also helping us achieve the goal that we were after to start with. So what is this partnership with Slack and TIBCO, and why has it been so meaningful for us? Well, we focus on adoption because we want to lead to those cool conversations like, are people collaborating? Do networks exist? If a new person joins, what should their network be to find that early and critical success? How can we drive performance? And that's where we get into the applied analysis, where at TIBCO, through network analysis, through adoption, we can start to see high-level insights that show that Slack adoption does correlate with higher engagement, higher performance. A broader network does correlate with the ability to close tickets and answer customers quicker. And showing that gives our ROI in a very meaningful way, and something our leadership, of course, loves to see. So with this, I guess my challenge to you is, if you open your Slack data and you start to pair it with your workforce data, can you identify if there's a gap in your active versus inactive users, and where? Can you leverage tools like Poly or even focus groups to understand why groups that aren't using Slack are not using Slack, and the champions, why they are? Can you leverage those champions' voices to convince those that haven't adopted the platform yet? How's your leader behavior? Are they using Slack, and are they affecting the behavior downstream? Can you leverage their voice and channels to improve that? Where are your most powerful networks? Do you have silos, and can you break them down by leveraging where silos don't exist across the rest of your organization? And largely, are your teams collaborating? I encourage you to engage with Slack and your CSM. We've had just amazing success in engaging with our CSM and doing that. And if you need help analyzing that data, you can always reach out to us here at TIBCO. We're happy to help. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lindsay to talk through this new messaging feature in the messaging activity in Slack.
Thank you, Nick. Very impressive. You're a leader in your field and someone I personally love to learn from. So thank you again for joining us today. Before wrapping up, we wanted to share a recently launched feature that we think is increasingly important as more and more employees globally work remotely. This feature is message activity. As you know, Slack is this channel-based messaging platform. It makes it easier to communicate and knowledge share by bringing everything and everybody into one place: files, conversations, tools, and people. And it really is our stance that Slack makes work easier and faster. I think we just saw that with TIBCO. As we think about the current world events and the growth of remote working, whether this particular shift is temporary or whether it's the future, we know that the workforce is going to be more distributed. And so as we think about this, it's really important more than ever that your organizations are organized, connected, and up to date. Message activity is a feature that we launched that will actually help optimize your channel-based messaging to really make sure that your key announcements are being read. If you think about any HR policies, business policies, or work from home policies, these are really important broadcast announcements. And after listening to you, our champions and users, we wanted to make you more comfortable using Slack for these types of announcements. With message activity for the first time, you can holistically measure the impact that these announcements are having in Slack. So a quick overview: message activity is available only on certain messages, those messages in public channels with 50 or more members. And only admins and the people who they delegate this to will have access to insights like total views, top replies, viewers by department, and more. Historically, we know that it has been very hard to know if people are actually seeing your messages in Slack, and to prove that tangible value of Slack as a communication channel to your organization and to department leaders. Email has historically been a little bit easier, where you're able to say, oh, this is how many people I sent this to, and this is how many people clicked and opened that email. Message activity, again, is really that first step to provide similar insights and prove the reach that Slack has at your organization. So message activity has 4 big components to it. The first one is activity over time. So you'll be able to see things like unique viewers, how many viewers reacted, and how many times a post was shared in other public channels. You'll also be able to see engagement for the past hour, the past day, past week, or the past 30 days. And then you can break it down by where users first saw that post as well. So this is the client section. Did viewers see this first on browser, on desktop app, or on mobile? In a few minutes, I'm going to actually walk through an example as to how this information can be used. But essentially, when thinking about clients, if you're seeing that your messages are having more mobile views versus desktop views, then you may want to consider different ways of structuring your messages to better fit the mobile viewer. After client, we then have top replies component here. These are the top threaded replies ranged by the number of reactions that they've received. This can help you understand, what are people talking about, what's really eliciting a reaction from these users. And then the final component, and this is probably my favorite part of message activity, is views by department. This is only going to be available for those of you that have configured the department field via Skim. But once you do have that, it's incredibly valuable. It's going to show you all the viewers for this message and then what percent were from each department. So really answering that question of, are you reaching your target audience? We built message activity with two groups of people in mind. The first one is organization and department leaders or executives, and the second is internal comms teams. We think those two really go hand in hand, really working together on making sure the right messages are getting shared across an organization. I want to note that this was not built to be a read receipt feature. We built this feature for broad company or team-wide messages. And that's really why we're focused on public channels today and channels with more than 50 users. So again, some sample use cases are any type of executive engagement. If you're ever running an AMA, this is a really great feature. You can see how many people are actually engaging with each question and with each response. You can use this to measure any type of org-wide announcement, make sure it's landing and people are viewing it. And you can really start to use these insights to help strategize and optimize your internal communications. Is this the right channel for this message? Are the right teams viewing messages that I'm sending to this channel? Is this the right time to post a message? You can actually compare the engagement between two messages sent to the same channel but posted at different times. I will note, and I'm going to note this because we've gotten lots of feedback around this, we don't yet have this data in an aggregate view. However, you can look at unique messages and see which ones are getting the most engagement and start to draw insights from there. And then lastly, and I really want to hone in on this again, this is the first step to making it easier for you to show that tangible value and ROI of Slack through the real engagement that you're seeing for your messages in our platform. So on that note, let's take a real world example. We're going to show you some real data from our own Slack instance. And I'm going to walk you through some of the insights that our own internal comms team were able to discover with message activity. So we have two posts, both from our co-founder and CEO, Stewart Butterfield. This first one we're looking at here was sent out in early April, right at the start of going fully remote. And the components in red, those red boxes, are the ones that our internal comms team deemed most important for their initial goals. One is the time that he posted. So this was at 5 o'clock in the morning Pacific time. Then we have the number of viewers, and we also have the client by which viewers first read this message. And we can see that about 67% of Slack overall viewed this message, which is a pretty good amount. And of those who viewed it, 37% actually went through and clicked. And we had a whopping 43% of views on mobile. Now compare that message to this one. It was posted, I think, about 2 days later in the same announcements global channel. The time is different. So this was posted at 3:45 p.m. Pacific time compared to 5 a.m. in the last post. And we had a lot more views. We had about 82% of Slack viewing this, and we had way more reactions. I will note that the content of this post was very different too. We were announcing new holiday days for the summer, and everybody loves a good day off. That being said, we think that this also had an impact on the huge number of shares that we saw for this message. This message was shared to 54 other public channels. A lot of this was from leaders of different departments and managers wanting to make sure that their teams saw this great news. And again, we had a big mobile viewership still, even at this time, at 37%. So what does all this mean, and what can we actually do with this information? After analyzing this data, our internal comms team discovered the following. First, our average views are around 75 to 80% for our global announcements channel. That's a lot. Keep in mind, we're also Slack, and we use Slack all the time. And I know we've gotten some feedback from our customers asking for benchmarks. And I will note, we don't actually have benchmarks to give you today. And that's because we understand that every organization uses Slack differently. This is just giving you a bit of insight into how we're using it here at Slack. So again, in our global announcements channel, our average views today are around 75 to 80%. And when we started digging into this, we wanted to understand how this maybe has changed over time. So we compared this viewership to before going fully remote, and we saw previously we were actually closer at 60 to 70%. What I definitely recommend to all of you now is take some time, go through your company-wide messages, go through your big team messages, and understand how the transition to remote working has maybe impacted the reach of your Slack messages. And, with any internal comms team, I'm sure you're using a number of other tools and solutions to share messages as well. Can you compare the Slack view rate against others to make sure that you're using the right tools to get your message across? Where are you best reaching your employees? Jumping back in here, we saw that average reactions were closer to 10 to 25% of viewers. Again, not a bad number. And our messages tend to peak about 12 to 24 hours after posting, meaning the majority of views that message is going to get tend to happen in the first 12 to 24 hours. Again, you can start to use this information to then optimize, when do you want to post a message? When our internal comms team started digging into this data, they were blown away by a couple of different things. And the first was really the share of views coming from mobile. We're on our laptops every day and doing most of our work at Slack on Slack. So when you see some messages getting as high as 45% viewership on mobile, that really made us question why that might be. Maybe unsurprising, but we saw that messages sent outside of normal work hours or during meals tended to generate a higher view rate from mobile than from desktop. As a result of this insight, we then started to think about how we should be formatting different messages that are sent at different times and gave recommendations to executives about when they should be posting these different types of messages as well. I'd love for you to think about the different ways that you could be using message activity at your companies. So maybe the next time your company is doing a large-scale event, maybe an AMA or an all-hands meeting, think about how you can use message activity on each of the important posts to understand which have the highest reach, viewership, or engagement, reactions. Can you use this information to start to understand how your employees are reacting to the information that you're sharing and what they might be thinking around these different notes as well? So at this point, today you've watched me go through 3 components of measuring Slack value: adoption, maturity, and sentiment. You've learned how TIBCO has implemented this framework to drive adoption. Thank you again, Nick. And you've gotten an inside scoop on how Slack messages perform. Now it's time to get you started. We want to leave you with a few additional resources that can help you to continue and build your own analytics strategy that works for your company, helps you drive the adoption you want to see, and helps you get the most value out of Slack that's possible. You can find links to these resources here. And on that note, thank you again for joining us today, and please stick around for the live Q&A. We can't wait to meet more of you.